Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Valentino Stoll.
Hey now.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. We have a special guest this week, and that's Cameron Dutro. Cameron, do you want to just remind people who you are?
Sure, yeah. I'm Cameron Dutro. I work at GitHub, and I am here to talk about a deployment solution that I wrote called Kuby.
Very cool. Hey, folks, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been working on actually building out Top End Devs. If you're interested, you can go to topenddevs.com/podcast, and you can actually hear a little bit more about my story, about why I'm doing what I'm doing with Top End Devs, why I changed it from devchat.tv to Top End Devs. But what I really want to get into is that I have decided that I'm going to build the platform that I always wished I had with devchat.tv, and I renamed it to Top End Devs because I want to give you the resources that are going to help you to build the career that you want, right? So whether you want to be an influencer in tech, whether you want to go and just max out your salary and then go live a lifestyle with your family, your friends, or just traveling the world or whatever, I want to give you the resources that are going to help you do that. We're going to have career and leadership resources in there, and we're going to be giving you content on a regular basis to help you level up and max out your career. So go check it out at topenddevs.com. If you sign up before my birthday, that's December 14th. If you sign up before my birthday, you can get 50% off the lifetime of your subscription. Once again, that's topenddevs.com. Now, Kuby, just doing a little bit of homework here. It does Docker Kubernetes magic. And yeah, you know, my DevOps skills used to be current, and then they invented all this container stuff. So...
Right.
Yeah, I'm kind of liking the idea of a Kuby, right? Do you want to give people kind of the elevator pitch, you know, what it is, what it's for, who it's designed for people to use, stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. And first of all, well, thanks for having me on. Kuby and deployment and something and stuff like that is really near and dear to my heart. And the story behind Kuby actually starts with an episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. I know, it's kind of coming full circle. So let's see. I think I'm going to have to look this up, but it's episode 300 something of the podcast. Stefan Wintermeyer came on and talked about why, or sort of one of the problems or the holes that he sees in Rails, which is that there's no active deployment for Rails apps. And so what he meant by that was, you know, we have all these other great frameworks in Rails for interacting with the database. We have active record for that and active storage for storing files in the cloud, you know. Action text, all these other cool frameworks, but we don't have anything for deployment. And that's kind of funny because like that's one of the big like things that you want to do with your app. Once you're finished building it, you want to put it online somewhere. And there's not really a set solution out of the box that Rails has for that. And so on the podcast, Stefan was saying like, I don't really know if that needs to be a tool or if it just needs to be an official Rails guide or what, but it would be nice to have some official guidance in that regard. So I heard that episode and thought that he was totally right. And I didn't really understand why there wasn't sort of a blessed path for that for Rails. And so, you know, fast forward a couple of years, I didn't think that it was going to be me that was going to work on that because, you know, like you mentioned, Chuck, my DevOps skills were like not fantastic. And it wasn't something that I really had specialized in in my career. So I was like, well, maybe one day, you know, maybe Stefan himself will do this. Maybe somebody else will step up and, you know, build a deployment solution for Rails that is kind of the de facto. But, you know, in the intervening years, like nobody really did that. And so kept that in the back of my mind. And then a couple of years later, the company I worked for at the time, Lumos Labs, started to use and adopt Kubernetes to deploy Lumosity.com, the big monolith that we had for Lumosity.com. Mm-hmm. And initially we used Docker and ECS for that, the Elastic Container Service, which is like Amazon's sort of precursor to Kubernetes. And ECS is fine. It's kind of bare bones. Everything runs in containers, but it's not particularly easy to use their interface. And, you know, it really just runs containers. It doesn't do anything else besides that. So no databases, no Redis, for example. You'd have to set all that stuff up yourself manually. So we used that for a long time. And then hired somebody who actually had much more experience with Kubernetes. And he started to convert all of us over to using Kubernetes. And also, you know, we also adopted a deployment web app called Samson by Zendesk and started to sort of deploy everything with that setup. And, you know, there was a moment for me where I remember sort of watching over his shoulder and we were deploying Lumasi.com for kind of the first time, and just watching the output scroll by and watching the output from kube control, seeing everything sort of being stood up automatically. And it was one of those moments that you have sometimes in tech where you're just like super blown away by how just, magical the tool is. I'll never forget how amazed I was that it was doing all these things automatically when you just would configure what you wanted the tool to do, and then it would go do it and make sure your app was running and all the other important parts to make sure your app stays up. So I mentioned that we had background jobs, I think, or most apps do. And so it would start up the background job processor and connect to a Redis, and, all that stuff just kind of happened automatically, and there was no intervention necessary. And so that was a real light bulb moment. And so when that happened, I thought, why don't we do this? Why doesn't Rails have something like this that runs on Kubernetes that anybody could take advantage of? And so that's how Kuby was born. So you had asked what Kuby is. I just gave sort of some background. Kuby is a deployment tool. I want it to be active deployment for Rails. It's written to be very simple, minimal configuration. I think the tagline for a long time was, deploy your app with almost, use Kubernetes with almost no configuration, because Kubernetes is kind of known for being very config heavy, and Kuby is very config light. It makes a lot of intelligent default choices for you, like you might expect as a Rails dev. So there's a single config file. You can put your config in there, and all your config really is just a couple of credentials. So, I want to deploy to DigitalOcean or Linode or AKS, Azure's Kubernetes offering. Any of those, we have plugin providers for those things. So you configure those, you tell it where you want to push your Docker image, and then you run a few commands, and next thing you know, your app is online and being served and can serve traffic. So yeah, that's Kuby in a nutshell.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that's kind of hung me up, is that, so I like running my app in a Docker container locally. I mean, it's really convenient because I don't have to go and like sandbox crap or use a gem set for RVM or anything like that, right? I just, hey, install the stuff I need. Okay, done, right? Oh, I need a different version of Ruby now. Okay, redeploy this sucker on the other image, right? It's really convenient locally. But then I started looking at Kubernetes, right? Because I've been hosting on DigitalOcean forever. And I was thinking, okay, well, now I've got top-end devs. I'm also incidentally using the same code base for Podcast Playbook, right? And so it's got an admin system that I've put on a separate server from the main site that hosts all the courses and stuff for people. And then I've got some other stuff going on with like Redis and PostgreSQL and things like that. And I'm using kind of their cloud database hosting for that. But, eventually I'm going to have to scale it, or at least I'm hoping eventually I'll have to scale it, right? And so then I'm going to need a load balancer, and I'm going to need more than one server running this stuff. And so I was thinking, oh, cool. I'll just, I'll figure out Kubernetes and try and use it. And the learning curve was so overwhelming that I was just like, maybe I'll just stick this on VPSs for right now.
Yeah.
And then hopefully when I have that problem, I'll also have budget to hire somebody who really can do this for me. And so that's where this appeals to me, right? Is it's like, okay, well, now I can put this on Docker containers. I can use some kind of Docker container registry. And then hopefully I can do this on my own and be my own IT guy for a little longer before I have to hire somebody to manage all this stuff. And I'm assuming too, at some scale, you're going to want somebody that just does all the monitoring and management stuff. For now, it's just me.
Yeah. Right. Well, no, I mean, that's really, I think, an important point to make, that web development and building websites, putting them online can be a very specialized job, right? Like you talk about hiring an ops person. That's really how a lot of companies are organized. There's, the devs who work on the actual features. And then there are ops people who make sure that the website's up, and, or even, another job title that's kind of common these days is site reliability engineer. So they're responsible for making sure the site's up all the time. And, there can sometimes be, maybe a contentious relationship between the devs and the ops people. And that's, I think, really why DevOps became a thing, right? So now we've got people who do both dev and ops, or do dev as part of ops. And so there's a lot more crossover there. But I want to also call out how right you are about the steep learning curve of a lot of these ops tools. Like not even just Kubernetes, but a lot of ops tools are really complicated. Oh, yeah. They're geared much more toward, someone who does it full time, someone who used to be a network or sysadmin, who's like very familiar with firewall rules and, networking in general. And that's really, in my experience, not the average Rails dev. Most average Rails devs are slinging code in Ruby and writing features. And, they're great at doing that stuff. But when it comes to the ops side, there's a lot less confidence they have there that what they're doing is the right thing. And a lot of times, they open up security holes. They don't mean to because they don't understand the tooling. And so what I started to realize is that most devs would rather not have to care about ops at all. They want to care about it exactly 0% of the time. And there are great tools out there. I mean, you have the opportunity as a dev to use a bunch of different deployment solutions. It's not like the Rails world or even the web development world is really lacking tools in this regard. Like, you can really get as deep or as shallow as you want. You could use Heroku, which is a phenomenal hosting platform. Maybe not in the recent couple of years, but or recent couple of months, but certainly one of the most popular ones for Rails devs. It's so easy. Just git push, and next thing you know, your app's online. They do all of the networking and database management for you. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And you can use Elastic Beanstalk. You could use Render. There's so many options. But I think that there's also a lot to be said for managing some of this on your own, because I come from the world of Capistrano and copying PHP files up to an FTP server, and there's nothing simpler maybe than git push, but there's also maybe the one step slightly less complicated even than that is just copying some files up to a server, right? And that's essentially what Capistrano is doing. It just takes some files, it copies them up, maybe it clones your repository, and then runs your app, using system control or whatever. And there's a lot to be said for having sort of that level of simplicity or that level of control over your environment. When Capistrano's, it's just a Ruby script, and you have a bare metal server up somewhere or a VPS you can put stuff onto. I really, as a developer, I kind of miss that. Like, I don't want to have to, depend on Render or depend on, ECS or any of these platforms. I want to be able to have this awesome experience and control that I get with Capistrano, but still have the power of something like, Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or any of these orchestration tools. Mm-hmm. So, and in my opinion, too, like most of like these orchestration tools like Docker Swarm, like Kubernetes, are much too complicated for the average person. And like I said, most devs don't want to think about those things. They want to think a layer up from the stack, but maybe not as high as Render or Heroku, right? So what I really want out of Kuby is to be as flexible and as, developer friendly as Capistrano, but, there's no vendor lock-in with it. It's just a tool that you run on your machine. It's not anything more than that. There's no hosted option. There's no vendor lock-in. It's all open source and usable as just an average dev.
So I want to speak to some of this because I was using DigitalOcean's app platform for a while to host top-end devs. And I started hearing from people that it would inexplicably go out, like my website would. And so I'd go look and I'd get this weird error from DigitalOcean. And I kept sending them support requests, and they're good about answering them, but nobody could figure out why my app would just randomly not work. And it wasn't an error from my side. It was an error on their system. And so I moved everything over to Capistrano and a server on one of their droplets. If you're not familiar with droplets, that's DigitalOcean's VPS option. So I set everything up there, and Capistrano, it works just like I expect it to because I've used it for years. The problem I had was figuring out, okay, I've got this server that I need to run Puma, and I want to use Puma, proxy behind Nginx and blah blah blah, and it works terrific on my local machine, but I had to figure out how to make it a system start, restart service and provide a socket to Nginx. And there wasn't good documentation out there for how to put that configuration file onto the server so that Puma would actually just start up on its own. And then when I wanted to restart it, I could just tell the system control system to restart the Puma service. And I think I still have a bruise on my head from like 3, 4, 5 weeks ago when I did this, because I banged my head against the wall for like 3 days straight trying to get it up. And then once I had it up, then it was like, well, flip, I'm copying this file over to any other server I have to set up for Podcast Playbook. And then the other issue I ran into was that I had to do the same thing for Sidekick. And it wasn't identical, right? It wasn't identical to setting up the Puma service. And so I had to go in there and fiddle with it until I set it up. And even now, I still don't know if it's running optimally. I just know that it works. And so we talk about Capistrano being kind of a level simpler or a level more complicated than git push. And that's true after you have the server set up. And all of and I also need it to do all of the Rails stuff. And so I need all the dependencies there. And I added a new dependency. And so now I have to go onto the server and install the C library that it relies on. And so I had to jump through all those hoops. Yeah. Now when I need to deploy, I just cap production deploy, right? And it just goes. And even if I add a new gem, 99% of the gems I'm using are straight up Ruby. And so there's no dependency that I'm missing. But yeah, it was a giant hassle to set it up. And so that's the other thing is if there was some kind of, because the containers just work. I just pull down a Ruby container that's designed to run Rails and I'm basically done.
Right.
And so that's the appeal that it has for me is, I like the containers. I like the simplicity, but it's a headache. And I'd like to be able to set up triggers so that, when I do a git push, it goes, oh, do you want to deploy this? And I say yes. And then it just deploys it. Or I don't push to the production branch until I'm ready to deploy or something like that. Because the DigitalOcean app platform actually worked that way. I'd push to the production branch and then it would automatically pull it down and deploy it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of what you're describing is the pain that I also have gone through with Capistrano. Like specifically the problem where, so I gave a RailsConf talk about Kuby and mentioned, and made it online to YouTube a couple weeks ago. And one of the comments under the video was somebody saying, Capistrano is great, but it will fail the first 19 times you try to run it because you haven't gotten everything figured out yet. And that's absolutely right. Like once you've got it figured out, it's great. It's smooth sailing. It works really well. But, getting to that point, and I feel like I had to do that every single time I made a new app. I had to go deploy it somewhere and some weird thing was wrong, the version of CentOS or whatever that I was using, didn't support installing the GCC compiler version that I needed. In fact, that's actually something that happened to us at Lumos. We had this old cron server that it was all provisioned with Chef, I think. And there were some scripts on there that were supposed to run every day that would handle our billing reconciliation. And
I loved Chef until I didn't anymore.
Yeah. Well, and Chef is great. It's just Chef suffers from the same problems that you would suffer from with Capistrano, right? Like it needs to go into a server and install things, but if the environment isn't exactly what it expects, it'll just blow up.
Yep.
Right. So what happened to us, we had this old app cron server that nobody wanted to move or migrate or touch because it handled all of our billing reconciliation. And so one day, we had this bug, we had fortunately some monitoring on there, and that server, the billing stuff started to fail. And we were like, that's weird. What happened? And it turns out that one of our engineers had upgraded the Rails app to Ruby 2.6, which introduced the new safe navigation operator. And so that code is the same code that was used on the app cron servers. So everything worked fine in production because we upgraded the production servers to 2.6, but nobody thought to upgrade the app cron server to 2.6. And so when the billing reconciliation code ran, there was a safe navigation in that code that stopped working. It was literally a syntax error on Ruby 2.5, which is what this old server was running. And so we were like, oh, dang it. Okay, I guess we got to go in and upgrade the server. So we went in to upgrade the server, but we couldn't install 2.6 because it depended, the GCC that was on that system was too old. And so we were like, okay, let's upgrade GCC. There was no package available for that CentOS version. So we're like, okay, well, let's install it manually. And that also failed for some reason. So we're stuck with this yak shave where we couldn't upgrade CentOS because upgrading CentOS would mean that we'd have to go and re-provision the AMI or the Amazon instance for this, which is the whole point of, we didn't want to do that in the first place because it was.
This is why I don't use Passenger anymore, right? Because the same thing. You have to go to deploy Nginx by hand to make Passenger happy. Yeah.
Right. You just get stuck in this totally hellish cycle of not being able to do anything because you want to upgrade all of these things that depend on each other, right? So that's a lot of the pain that Docker solved, right? It was like, you don't need to worry about what the operating system has installed. You just put everything you need into this image, and then that can be, run anywhere.
Well, the other thing is that the build artifact that you create with Docker, I have Docker installed on my Mac, but if anybody else has Docker, right, with anywhere close to the same capabilities, and I tend to keep mine updated, so it'll run on the latest version of Docker Desktop. They have a working artifact, right? I don't have to go tell them, go install all this crap on your computer.
Exactly. Right. Like whenever I get a new Mac and I'm trying to install like Nokogiri, I always have to go through the hell of trying to figure out libxslt and this other. And unfortunately, it's just a lot of brew installs.
What are those flags?
Yeah. Right. What are the flags? Exactly. Like what are the flags? Like SQLite sometimes has problems, but if you just use that pre-built, like, Rails, or I think it's a Ruby Docker image, it has all of that stuff installed. So literally like gem install Nokogiri, like just works. Like you don't have to ever like mess around with that stuff anymore. So that's
the other one that gets me is the Postgres app. And then it's, what's the magic path to get the PG gem to play nicely with it? Anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I don't have the right version of Postgres installed in it. So now I got it.
Yeah, it's such a massive pain. And that's like how, like a lot of the, I don't know, a lot of the friction that I used to encounter with Rails development. Like even like trying to get a new like junior person set up with a Rails app. I mean, I worked at Twitter back when Twitter was still using Ruby, and like every time somebody would come onto the team, we'd have to spend like 3 hours getting their laptop set up because there were so many obnoxious compile errors and whatnot, So yeah, I'm glad that a lot of the problems that used to happen there have been solved by Docker.
Yeah. One question that I have, I'm sorry, Valentino, I feel like I'm just hogging the mic.
I get to it. I have lists going here.
Okay. So one thing that I'm curious about though is like I'm using Docker Compose on my machine. And I know that there are sort of client side versions of Kubernetes that you can run on your Mac or whatever. So would this work there too? So I can test out the whole ball of wax or?
Yeah, for sure. So let me step back real fast and just make sure that I've said this so that it's sort of loaded into our brains here. Kubernetes works with Docker images, not necessarily Docker images, but images built with Docker or a Docker adjacent tool. There's lots of other tools that also build images. And so that's what Kubernetes does. It takes an image and then it will run it for you and make sure the networking is connected. Like, if you want to connect to a MySQL running in the same cluster, you can do that because the networking is all set up for you. So that's what those two tools are doing. And that's what also what Kuby does. It'll build an image out of your Rails app and install all the right packages and whatnot. And then we'll push that to a registry, Docker registry, where you push all of your images. And then it'll run, when you start your app and deploy it, the Kubernetes cluster will pull down those images and run them. So, okay, so I think we're on the same page there.
Hi, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And lately I've been coaching some people on starting some podcasts and in some cases, just taking their career to the next level. Whether you're beginner going to intermediate going to advanced, whether you're trying to get noticed in the community or go freelance, I've been helping these folks figure out how to get in front of people, how to build relationships, and how to build their careers and max out and just go to the next level. So if you're interested in talking to me and having me help you go to the next level, go to topenddevs.com/coaching. I will give you a 1-hour free session where we can figure out what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and figure out what the next steps are. And then from there, we can figure out how to get you to the place you want to go. So once again, that's topenddevs.com/coaching. So can I run this locally?
Oh, right. Yes. Okay. So all of that stuff can run locally because the registry and Kubernetes, all of that is runnable anywhere, really. So a server or your laptop. Kuby has a series of plugins called providers that will let you deploy to DigitalOcean or Linode. And there's also one that deploys to or uses this tool called Kind. And Kind is like a cluster that can run inside your locally running Docker desktop. So you would just use the Kind provider and then deploy to Kind essentially. And then that would just run on your machine. You could hit the website localhost 3000 like you would normally do.
I mean, it all sounds great to me.
I'm glad to hear that.
I mean, I got to jump in here. I mean, I'm torn.
Yeah.
And from a certain point in a Ruby app or Rails app, I could totally see the allure of Kubernetes and Docker and all that. My problem is more of like the low to middle tier apps, right? Like that need to change and don't need structure overhead. For the most part. I know that probably isn't the most use case because of the behemoths that are out there now. But I feel like there's still a huge number of people where maybe that problem of maybe Kubernetes may be overkill and maybe Kuby solves mitigating some of that overhead. I was playing with Kuby, the Daku, which you can run the same Roku. And it's still hard to beat that same way and be able to just get push Daku the same way you would. But, having run a Docker server before this morning and it worked really well. I was able to deploy to Linode. It was great, but it's still, like you mentioned, Heroku, Git push Heroku. There's an open source version of that where like upgrading is terribly painful. Mm-hmm. So I definitely see the alert of having something more manageable in Kubernetes to make that transition easier, right? Like how does the upgrade process work for Kubernetes?
So you have actually hit on like the most difficult part of Kubernetes. I wish that. So yes, so Kubernetes unfortunately is very difficult to upgrade, mostly because they'll the APIs and whatnot will change. And when I say APIs, I mean you'll apply these resources to the cluster. It's all YAML config, right? Kuby, for the most part, hides all that from you. You don't have to actually mess with that YAML config. But what it's doing behind the scenes is building up this large amount of YAML and then shoving it into the cluster and saying, do what I want you to do with this YAML. Set up my networking and whatnot. What usually happens with a cluster, though, is that it gets into a particular state, and that state can be state that you created, that Kuby created, or state that an operator created. So an operator being a special program running inside your cluster that will respond to requests to, for example, create a database. In our case, a cockroach database or Postgres. And so there's some implicit state there too. And when it comes to upgrading the cluster, sometimes those upgrades work flawlessly because they try not to break anything between from the previous minor version to the next one. However, in my experience, there have been some pretty rough upgrades. So 119 to 120 was pretty rough because they moved the ingress controller or the ingress API to a different namespace. And so Linode, for example, will automatically upgrade. Like they'll give you an email, they'll say, hey, we're going to deprecate support for this previous version that you're currently using. You need to go in and upgrade. And if you don't, we'll force upgrade your cluster at this particular date, which is not great. And, it can be kind of scary. I think they have to do that because if they don't, they'll end up, supporting these super old versions of all this stuff. But those upgrades, this just happened to my dad's construction company website. They force upgraded his to the latest version, and the whole thing went down. It was just not, I got this email from the uptime robot and it was like, your site's down because they force upgraded you. So that story in Kubernetes is not very good right now. And correspondingly, that story is totally non-existent in Kuby. And that's one of the things that I really would like to have a better answer for. And we don't currently have a good answer for it. What most people do in the Kubernetes world, even without Kuby, is they'll create a new cluster, migrate everything to it sort of manually, and then deploy to that, from then on. And they'll just go delete the old cluster. That's really not viable most of the time. So, and Kubernetes is pretty mature, but it's also, there are some aspects of it like this that are pretty not amateur, what's the word? Pretty immature, I suppose. So yeah, that's why it's so funny you asked it as the first question, because it's like, that's not a great experience, not a great story right now. And I would love it to be better. I hope that we'll be able to come up with something.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at, I didn't mean to surface the biggest pain point. But what I was getting at,
hold still, I'm going to poke you in the eye.
Yeah.
I'm going to get sold. More of what I was getting at is, I'm trying on the Kubernetes as the de facto deployment service, right? If we want to make active deployment, right? Should it be on Kubernetes and why?
Yeah. Right.
That's an interesting question though.
It is.
Because I feel like if we have active deployment, just like we have active storage, and you can choose cloud storage or local storage. You've got the active job, and you can pick Sidekick or Rescue or delay job or any of those. Yeah, it seems like if we had active deployment, it would make sense to say, Kubernetes or a VPS or right. Or I like that as an option, right? So then it could adapt onto a Kuby or adapt onto something a little less painful setup than Kubernetes. I don't know.
For sure. I think that's also a really good question or a really good point to make. Why Kubernetes? Why? Because I personally think that Kubernetes is the right target for something like active deployment. And the reason I say that is because, your app is never just your app. Your app is obviously your app and your code that you have in your app, but there's also a bunch of external stuff. So I mentioned before, Sidekick workers, database, Redis, Elasticsearch, whatever. There's always a bunch of sort of peripheral stuff on the outside of your app. If all you needed to do was put your code on a server and say Puma run or, bundle exec Rails server, then, this would be Kubernetes would be a terrible choice because it's way more complex than you need for something like that. But because there's all these external peripheral services that you need to access, or not even, I want to say services, processes that you need to also run and manage, doing all of that with Capistrano is doable. Doing all of that with any other platform is absolutely doable. But Kubernetes makes that just a lot easier. And the way I talked about this in the RailsConf talk was, if you are using Capistrano, then the primitive that you're working with is just a server somewhere. Capistrano uses SSH to connect to your server. All that it has to work with is what you've given it on that server. So that server may or may not have system control. That server may or may not, be running AMD processors or, x86 processors versus M1 processors, right? So it may not even have an internet connection. It's just, you're given this platform to run on, but all it is a server that has some software running on it. You don't even know or control what that is. So from a tooling perspective, like as a developer, you know a lot more about the server than Capistrano does. You know that it's running this version of Ubuntu. You know it's got these tools installed, but Capistrano doesn't know that stuff. You have to basically tell it what to do. And it can kind of rely on certain tools existing. Like there has to be an SSH daemon running, of course. But, that's about all that it knows about your server. So from a Capistrano author's perspective, all that they can really do is let you run commands, and you have to sort of specify what those commands are to a large degree. When it comes to Kubernetes, however, you have a much larger, much richer API that you can write code against. You can, for example, be totally confident that your server or that your platform can run Docker images. You can be totally confident that the networking between pods, and pods, by the way, are just running containers. You can be sure that that's something that will just work, right? You don't have to go and configure that stuff. Well, you have to configure it, but you can guarantee that it's there and that you can use it. So you have a much larger surface area of APIs to contact, to access, and to do stuff with. Obviously, there are other tools that will do this, other platforms that will do this as well, but most of them are proprietary, right? So you could use Render, but Render's proprietary system, it would mean that you'd have to code specifically to Render's APIs. Kubernetes is running, is an open source project. A lot of these providers, these hosting providers like DigitalOcean will let you stand a Kubernetes cluster up, and that cluster is going to look exactly like a cluster that Linode would give you. So it makes it a much better target than just a bare metal server because of the richness and because it's going to be the same pretty much everywhere that something like active deployment could target. Because it's so rich, that means that Kuby can, for example, stand up a database for you. It can stand up a series of, it can stand up a Redis for you, and it can, use a plugin to stand up another set of pods that will be your Sidekick workers. So without having to do really much of anything besides, like, as a person who is going to be using Kuby, go to a provider like DigitalOcean and say, get me a cluster, get that cluster's ID, paste it into your config, and then you're off to the races. Like, there's no additional messing around that you have to do, right? And it's able to do that because it's targeting Kubernetes and because Kubernetes is such a rich platform and rich API.
So let's say that Kuby starts to become the de facto standard, right? And people are like building on top of this. Like, do you foresee like kind of Rails triggers into that process where, say, like, the typical Sidekick installation is, gem install Sidekick and then have some configuration somewhere that says where Redis is? I mean, is Kuby set up to be able to like just say, okay, I want Sidekick, and it will automatically do that for your Rails app? Or where does that divide lay now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Kuby supports a plugin architecture. So that's how the providers work, like DigitalOcean, Linode. They're just gems that you would add to your gem file, and you require those at the top of your Kuby config. And then in your config, you can say provider DigitalOcean, provider Linode. By the same token, you can also install like the Kuby Sidekick gem, require that, and then add plugin Sidekick. And there's some config that you need to add, but that's documented in the gem's README. So, your config initializers, sidekick.rb, there's basically a block of code that you can just copy paste, from the documentation. And that will then, when your app starts to, shove jobs into your queue, it'll just communicate directly with Redis automatically. And there's no additional configuration besides that you need to do. So yes, there is, to answer your question, yes, there is a paved path specifically for sidekick, and there could be, I mean, you can imagine how far you could take that, right? You could have a paved path for Elasticsearch and for everything else if you wanted to also.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, one of my biggest gripes currently is I experiment a ton. And I imagine like lots of people that, are working with Rails are experimenting a ton because there's so much new that changes and so much new to explore as you like start diving in more. How easy is it to say, like, let's say I have like a Linode machine or just as many apps as I want to it. Is Kuby set up for that kind of setup? Or is it more of geared toward a multi-node setup?
Yeah, interesting. So I think there might be two questions there. So like if you have a bare metal server there.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Like what you would normally deploy with Capistrano too. Is that the idea? Yeah, right. So because Kuby requires you to have a Kubernetes cluster, you would need to be running a cluster on that node. But there are like Kind or KubeADM. There are ways to do that on a bare metal server. There would have to be, you have to do some work on your own to get that to work, but it's definitely possible. And then the other thing too that Kubernetes offers is namespacing. So, when you deploy an app using Kuby, it will create a namespace for it, and all of the pods, so the app and the Sidekick workers and all of that are deployed into that namespace. And you could then, deploy another app into that same cluster, which would just choose a different namespace. And so they'd be isolated from each other in that regard. So yeah, you could deploy as many apps as you wanted to it. Yeah.
Because what I'm looking at, and so this is interesting, right? I mentioned that I'm running the same code base for both Top-End Devs and Podcast Playbook, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I deploy, I do cap production deploy, and it deploys it to Top-End Devs. It does not deploy it to Podcast Playbook. And the reason is because Top-End Devs is getting more usage, and I want to test bed the stuff before I push it to the other system. And so I'm imagining, that I might, or the other thing is it's a platform that I also imagine other people may want to use at some point. And so I'm liking the idea that, hey, when I'm ready to have it deploy globally, right, it just deploys to all of the namespaces. But at the same time, absolutely. If I wanted to go to just one app as kind of the test bed, then I can do that. And it's simple enough to do instead of having to have a Podcast Playbook environment config for the deploy and a production deploy file for the config, right?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, you could always do like the multi-tenant concept, I guess, but the other solution, like you mentioned, is just to deploy to like different clusters.
Multi-tenant is such a mess. I've never seen it done where people don't spend years trying to fix it.
Yeah, for sure. It's nice. And especially if you want to like truly like isolate the data from, between customers, then having another instance.
Which I definitely do. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So like Kuby actually supports different environments. And so what you could do is potentially like have, a bunch of environments configured that you could deploy to individually.
Is there a way of sharing sort of global config or global information? This goes back to Valentino mentioning like, you have to tell it where the Redis server is. You have to tell it where the Postgres server is and stuff like that, right? So I stick that in environment variables, but then I send the same environment variable to all of the things, right? So they can all talk to the things. So is there some kind of secrets management that goes into Kubernetes like that?
So first of all, you can specify that like shared configuration. So if you have a bunch of environments in your Kuby config, you can have a shared, like it's just a Lambda, essentially like it's instance exec into each environment, because it's a DSL. So you can have shared config. In terms of secrets, Kubernetes does have like probably the worst secret management. It's, and this, I say this with a bit potentially love in my voice here, but it's, there's a specific like object type in the K8s API called secret. But all that it does is take your secrets and like base 64 encode them. So like they're not
I feel
really
better
encrypted
now.
At all. Right. I know. So, the only, like if you have access to the cluster, then all you need to do is copy that string and like run base 64 decode and you can see the secret.
Right.
There are certain providers will like hook into that.
Yeah.
So like AWS, for example, has their KMS service, their key management service, and you can tell it to automatically encrypt your secrets. Like when they go into the Kubernetes API, it'll just automatically go and encrypt those for you. And the same thing is true, I'm sure, of other platforms. Kuby itself, like, doesn't do any additional encryption. I guess we could add that feature, but it doesn't do any additional encryption currently. It will, one thing that is kind of nice though, is as opposed to like, it won't, like Kubernetes will, or Kuby rather, will not turn your credentials into secrets. it keeps your credential, like, your credential, your cryptic credential store in Rails. It uses that to, like, it encourages you to store all your credentials in there. And those are encrypted,
Right.
Using a much better algorithm than base64. And so as opposed to like turning that into a secret, which would then get base64 encoded, it instead just, you copy that file up with your app like you would normally do with
Right.
Capistrano or anything else. And then, you just provide that Rails master key.
Yep.
And as long as the Rails master key is provided, the Rails will just look at that file and open it like it would normally do in development. So it doesn't try to do any like secrets decoding and stuffing into a secret. It just like copies that file up, and then you provide the master key, and it uses the key to unlock it all.
Yeah. The reason I asked is because that's the other issue I've had with running the same code base in multiple places is, the database strings and stuff like that. They all have to be managed differently, and putting that all into that in the secrets encrypt file in Rails, it started to get to be kind of a headache. And then I was using the same master key everywhere, and I'm like, this is not ideal. So
for sure.
Anyway.
One thing I will say actually about database, like passwords and usernames and stuff, I mean, specifically passwords, those are the secret part of connecting to a database. Kuby actually, because it's using, I mean, Postgres can do this too, but we actually, I say we, the project, I wrote the project or modified it so that it uses Cockroach DB now, which is like a lot more cloud native. And what I mean by that is it's sort of more designed to run in an environment like Kubernetes as opposed to Postgres, which you're going to have to massage to get to do that. And because Cockroach has like wire compatibility with Postgres, for the most part, it's a drop-in replacement for Postgres. There are some slight changes, but both those databases support connecting over SSL or over TLS. And so you can use a password if you want to, but what Kuby will do by default is generate a series of certificates for you. And then when you connect to the database, it's all over SSL and there is no password.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So you don't even have to worry about having a password. If Kuby manages your database, it just automatically will connect and work via SSL or via TLS certificates.
That makes sense. You just tell Cockroach, hey, these certificates are okay.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like the Cockroach server has the private key, but the like Rails app only has the public key, for example, and it will encrypt that, send it to the server, and the server decrypts it and runs the query and returns it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I've got a couple follow-up questions here.
I was going to say, I was going to let Valentino get a few more in here.
So two other things, just kind of looking at like, okay, putting Kuby in use, right? Like, I guess I have like kind of a 3-part question is like, what are some of the things that you've seen Kuby kind of solve for you, right? That maybe doing it a different way hasn't. Another is kind of building on that is like, how does, like, let's say you have a completely separate team devoted to DevOps or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Does the Kuby configuration kind of conflict with people running manual commands in kube control or something like that? How is that managed? And I guess the last one is related to your plugins, which are really cool. Are there third-party plugins? How does that kind of system work? And do you have plans to like open that up to a more like Kuby.install kind of setup?
Yeah, super good questions. So yeah, what does it solve is a good way to, I guess, well, I wrote them all down here, so I'll start with that one. For me, so like, as far as I know, there's only 2 apps that are currently using Kuby right now. One is my dad's construction website. Shout out to masterbuilderconstruction.com. Yeah, right. And that actually started life as a PHP app, and I converted to Rails because I needed a test bed it really exists only because I needed a test bed to like, run Kuby stuff with. The other one is the storybook so I work on the design infrastructure team or design engineering team at GitHub. And we work on Primer, this design system, and Primer view components specifically. And those view components, there's a storybook, which is like this cool design tool that you can use to like preview your components and whatnot. So it uses a Rails app to render the components, and then it will show them, in your UI. And so that's also deployed with Kuby into Azure Kubernetes service. So there's 2 apps that use it. And for me, what it really solves is just like, I spent so long, like I've, stood up numerous Rails apps in my career, either professionally or just on the side. And like every time I do that, I had to reach for something like Capistrano or I had to use Heroku. And, there's just limitations to each of those approaches. Like we talked about Capistrano at length. And Heroku is phenomenal, but they sort of limit you to, I think, 10 individual web apps on their free tier. So if you wanted to go and launch that 11th app, you'd have to kick one out before you could do that. Otherwise, you'll end up spending money, and I didn't want to spend money on it. which is funny because like with Kubernetes, like, there's no way to not spend money on that. So what I was looking for was a way to deploy something that I had more control over, but that I wouldn't break the bank to stand up, Like Heroku can get really expensive even if you just do a couple of really basic, like even if you want just a few more database rows, because I think it limits you to 100,000 rows or something. Even if you want 100,001 rows, you still have to pay. Like it's a pretty, like it goes up really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that I could actually get basically more freedom by spending the same amount of money. So you can run, I think on Linode right now, my dad's website is hosted for like about $25 a month, and it's just one node and there's a load balancer and it all works really well with Kuby. And there's no sort of like, I don't have to worry about the additional overhead of paying if I have I'm never going to have 100,000 rows in that database. But if I do, I don't have to go and like, worry about like, increasing my account limits or whatever. I can just like increase the size of the disk that it's on and be done. Right.
Yeah.
So it solves those problems. Like what I'm hoping is that it will eventually become, because I think that like my real goal behind this is not so much to stand up my dad's database or whatever, or my dad's website. My real goal is to prevent people from getting to that point in their Rails journey and realizing that they either have to spend money or have to struggle setting up Capistrano or whatever, or have to bump another app off their, free tier in Heroku. I want these developers that are coming up in Rails and coming up in Ruby to not get stuck at that step where they have no chance and no options to deploy something, or that Rails doesn't provide for them, right? So that's what I want Kuby to be, is this plugin system and this thing that you can just plug into your app and suddenly you're like off to the races, right? So yeah, that's like the major goal, is to make sure we don't lose companies and juniors and stuff at the step where they like make their app and then they can't deploy it. Okay, and then your next question was, does Kuby's config like supersede kube control commands? Like, what if you run a command with kube control and then that like somehow conflicts with your Kuby config? That's a good question. I mean, you can definitely do that, right? You could go and for example, mess with the config. The nice thing about Kubernetes is that there's not like you can go and mess with that config manually. You can go and apply, for example, a different YAML file or edit a resource directly in your editor that your kube control command could start up for you and then save it back and then mess things up. Totally true. One thing that's nice about Kubernetes though is that it's sort of, if you wanted to go and sort of fix that, or if you wanted to, like if you made a mistake, you could simply deploy with Kuby again, and it would replace the config that you just edited with the one that Kuby generated. And so that would hopefully fix any of the problems that you introduced by manually editing things. So there's sort of, that's kind of a double-edged sword though, right? Because you have like this, it's really just clobbering all the config that you already entered. If you wanted to persist that, if you wanted to make a change that would persist on multiple deploys, you would need to make that change in the Kuby config.
Right.
And Kuby uses this other project called KubeDSL to generate Kubernetes resources. And so there's really no part of that deploy process that you can't monkey with if you want to. I had to do a lot of that actually for the primer storybook. So yeah, so I would recommend that you not run, random kube control commands that are making changes to your resources, and instead go in and modify your Kuby config to tweak whatever you want so that it's a persistent change that you're making.
Yeah, but that was the same story with things like Chef and crap like that too, is, it would generate your config files and then basically just stick them on the server, and it wouldn't even check to see if something was there before. Exactly.
That's totally right. So, and it could really devastate things if you're not, like if it was making changes that, you weren't expecting or that weren't codified somewhere, you could really get into big trouble. Yeah, that's true. Okay. And then to answer your last question, third-party plugins. So right now there's one third-party plugin. So anybody can write a plugin. I have documentation for that on getkuby.io. You can make your own plugins. There's one that I know that, so all of the plugins except one have been written by me. They're in the Get Kuby organization. Yeah. But there was a great article published by the Evil Martians, Vladimir Demetyev, where he talked about deploying an app with Kuby, and he made some really interesting suggestions as part of that article. And so I think the Evil Martians are the guys behind Anycable, and they wanted to get Anycable working with Kuby. So they wrote a plugin for it that you can, I think it's just Evil Martian /Kuby-Anycable. And if you add that to your Kuby config, it'll automatically stand up like the Anycable Go service and just wires everything up for you. So it's a really good example of
that's cool.
Being able to take something that would normally have taken like a lot of effort to get running, and you can just drop a plugin in and it just works, right?
That's great.
Yeah. It was fun to see that happen.
Play with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's really because of the power of the Kubernetes platform. Like, imagine trying to do something like that, in Capistrano or even in Heroku. I guess it's all possible, of course, but I think it's much easier to do in Kuby than those other platforms.
Part of me is, I don't know if I'm like, it's the longevity of me being, a seasoned developer that I'm just used to the orchestration at this point, or some of these skills that maybe if I was just starting now, I would just overlook because other people do that, or there's other tools, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to tell where it's going to go. is what I'm saying. But for sure, it definitely, I really like the interface of Kuby. As a configuration, it did make it feel easier to deploy. I will say, because I similarly have been down that Capistrano path where I have a bare metal server and I want to, push it, and something isn't there, right? That it's expecting, and you have to figure out what it is. And that pain just sucks so much time away that if I could just destroy a cluster and make a new one, which, even though that's probably not the best thing, it still would save me time,
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That, I think a lot of the DevOps kind of revolution that we went through was realizing, well, I don't want to say revolution. There have been several stages of DevOps, I think, that we've all sort of experienced. And the first one was I can code up I could write a script, but it could be a chef script, or it could be a bash script that will provision my server for me. And then I can run that on the server every time I create a new server. Oh, that's going to save me so much time. And maybe on the first one it does, but then the second one it's going to blow up, and something's not quite the same as you remember from before. So that was sort of the first wave. We can codify these rules into a script or a chef cookbook or whatever and apply them everywhere. And that was pretty great, actually, for a long time. What we, I think, discovered, though, after that was that it's often a lot better to just have everything be ephemeral, except your database, obviously. You don't want to lose your data. But you talk about deleting a K8s cluster and bringing another one back up, that often is just a much easier solution than trying to debug the existing one, and because it's so ephemeral, I could just delete it and make a new one and move on with my life.
And, I even think of it too, stuff that you come back to after years, right? I have all these old apps that I have up that I don't want to upgrade or anything because they're just, they're so ancient. And, but I was curious, about something that I had worked on, and I wanted to try and get it up again, just see what was working, and I couldn't. And I was just I'm not going to do this.
Yeah.
But if I could just go and create a new cluster and redeploy it pretty easily, I feel like that could take out a barrier. It's definitely a pain point of mine that I still have.
Yeah, really good point. The bit rot that often sets in on these older applications. Yeah, absolutely. And Docker is the thing that really, I think, makes that easier. Kubernetes doesn't really help you in that. I mean, it would, because you could still launch it or deploy it or whatever, but the Docker image is really what would save you from that problem.
Yeah, but then I'd have to make a Docker image for those old apps.
Right. Totally. Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, man. Cool. There's actually, Ruby, so the Ruby official Ruby Docker image has, I think, versions going all the way back to 2.2, I want to say, maybe even 2.0. So you can go back pretty far in time with those images.
Hey, folks, if you love this podcast and would like to support the show, or if you wish you could listen without the sponsorship messages, then you're in luck. We're setting up new premium podcast feeds where you can get all of the episodes released after Christmas 2020 without the ads. Signing up will help us pay for editing and production, and you can go sign up at devchat.tv/premium. All right, well, let's do some picks. I think we've pretty well covered the topic.
Yeah.
Valentino, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure. I just came across this article from the guy that's been working on all the improvements to IRB. Was it Stan Lowe? He has this article on from bybug to Ruby debug. It's really cool. It outlines kind of all the pain points from bybug and kind of what's new and fresh in the new debugger in Ruby. And it's really cool to see all the new features that are coming out of there. And my other pick is Keychron. I have this new keyboard. It's wireless, and I haven't had any issues with it. It's mechanical, and I don't get keyboards that often, so this was a huge win for me.
Nice. All right, I'm going to jump in. I usually do a game board pick. I must be tired. A board game pick. The one I'm going to pick this time is a card game. It's called Quiddler. This one's been around for a long, long time. So a lot of people may have played it. Effectively, what you do is you have a hand of cards. You try and make words out of it. When you've put down all the cards in your hand, everybody else kind of gets a shot to put down what they've got. And then you tally up the points. You get bonus points for having the longest word or the most words, right? So you can put down 2 words. Anyway. Yeah, but that's pretty much the game. It ranks on Board Game Geek at a 1.43, which means it's on the simpler side. I mean, I basically told you how to play it. So, and you just play a number of hands starting at 3 cards and going up to however many cards. I like board games because I tend to win them. But yeah, it's a good family game. And so, yeah, I'm going to pick Quiddler. I'm trying to think what else I've got here for picks. I'm ramping things up on the meetup side. So keep an eye out if you go to topenddevs.com/meetups, or if you scroll down, it should show you all of the events we have coming up. But yeah, definitely check that out. I'm also thinking about adding a function. We're using Riverside to kind of do the show live, or to do the show among us. And I haven't been posting the videos, but it does have a feature where people can join as audience. And so you could kind of see us talking. You could see my messy office. And so I'm thinking about putting all of the show's live recordings on there. So if people want to come in and participate in the chat, that they can. But yeah, I'm really looking at that for events. Rails Remote Conf is coming up. CFP still open. I'm trying to think of what else I'm going to pick. My wife and I started watching a new show, and so I'll pick that, and that'll be my last pick. It's called The Lost Symbol. It's based on Dan Brown's book. It's on Peacock. I remember back in the day, you'd say it's on Channel 5 at 6 p.m. No, not anymore. It's on this streaming service. It's on Peacock. I think my wife picked up the Peacock Plus subscription when she wanted to watch Olympics. And then we held on to it because I wanted to watch Yellowstone. Now we're watching Lost Symbol. They've got a ton of stuff on there, just like all the rest of them. But yeah, this one's pretty good. It's based on the book. I haven't read the book in so long, I can't tell you how closely it's sticking to the story. But it's got, what's his name? Robert Langdon. And I think the characters all have the same names at the very least. So anyway, it's been decent. It's not riveting to me like Yellowstone was. Like Yellowstone, I couldn't quit watching it. But it's nice to just sit down and watch a show with the wife. And this has been a good show. So yeah, so I'll pick The Lost Symbol as a pick. All right, Cameron, what are your picks?
Well, definitely +1 to Quiddler. That's one I played before. It was pretty fun. Lost Symbol is interesting because I feel like that was did they make that into a movie at some point, like a couple years ago?
I don't think so. They did Angels and Demons, and they did the Da Vinci Code.
Oh, Da Vinci Code, right? But they haven't done Lost Symbol. Okay,
I don't think they did The Lost Symbol. The Lost Symbol, the book, wasn't as good as either the other ones. He's done 4 or 5 books that I've read. Mm-hmm. And Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code are definitely the better books.
Yeah, I've read all of them as well. It's like one of the only authors that I read anymore. But, I've been told that I have poor taste in literature, but I think they're really good. So I was hoping that maybe the Lost Symbol book or series is good too.
So far, we've watched like 3 or 4 episodes.
Okay, cool. I might have to check it out. So yeah, my picks are going to be, I just have 2 picks. One is View Component. So I work on the design engineering team, as I mentioned, at GitHub. And one of the projects we work on is the View Component framework. And View Component's a really, I would say, awesome way to like clean up your views, especially if you have logic in those views. Mm-hmm. I know that Joel Hoxley, the creator of View Component, has been on this podcast before and has done numerous talks about it. So at this point,
I am addicted to them.
Oh, nice. That's good to hear.
I use them all the time.
That's awesome. Yeah, we really, there's lots of adoption, and I just, wanted to pick it because it's like, I think maybe one of the best things to happen to the Rails view layer, like maybe ever. And then my last pick is going to be for Apple AirPods. I'm just a huge fan of AirPods. They work super well. I've dropped them like 1 billion times and they still work. And they're a little expensive, but they're absolutely worth it, especially the Pro AirPods. So, if you're looking for a pair of really, I would say, pretty good quality, durable, works automatically with everything I have that's Apple based. If you want something like that, then definitely give the AirPods a try.
Yeah, I haven't tried the AirPod Pro. I always just gotten the older AirPods. In fact, mine died and I recently got new ones, and I went and specifically got the old version of them just because I like them so much. Sure. But they stand up well. They pair with everything. And it seems like I have to replace them every like 3 or 4 years. And so, they hold up really, really, really well.
Yeah, 3 or 4 years for headphones is pretty good, I think. For like in-ear headphones,
Yeah, so.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, we'll wrap it up here. Till next time, folks. Max out.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN.
Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.